Well, welcome to another episode of Your Life Simplified. My name is George Fernandez, and I'll be your host for this episode. Today we're bringing a very special Your Life Simplified episode to you. You see, right now, we're in the middle of Hispanic Heritage Month. And for some of our advisors and our clients, it represents a very special time for us as we celebrate with our families, our Hispanic heritage, and exchange stories. And so we thought, why not have a couple of our very own Mariner Wealth Advisor associates come and share their stories? And along the way, I'll probably share a few of my own as well. So today I'd like to introduce you to two of our wealth advisors, Valerie Escobar and Alejandro Zayas. Mucho gusto, bienvenidos.
Muchas gracias.
It's great to have you guys here. And, the very first thing we're going to mention is as we go through our stories today, it's going to give our listeners a really great opportunity to hear from some different perspectives. You see, each of us comes from a different country. And my family comes from Mexico, and we're going to learn a little bit about, Valerie, where your family is from, and Alejandro, where your family is from. But in addition to that, we also represent three very unique generational differences, too. When my family came here in the early 1900s was a lot different than coming here in the last 20 years. And I think that'll come out a little bit in our stories as well. Let's go ahead and get started with our conversation today. So what I'd like to do first is have each of you share a little bit about yourself and the story of your family coming to the United States. So Valerie, why don't we start with you?
Great. Yeah, so I am from El Salvador. My family is from El Salvador. I was born there. And we came when I was very young. I was probably 2 or 3. It was during the Civil War in El Salvador. And so I kind of consider myself more of a second generation immigrant because I grew up here. I don't remember being born in El Salvador. We arrived here under refugee status. So we had very little at the time. My parents were trying to learn English, figure out jobs and everything when they got here. But I was very fortunate in that they put us in school. I started kindergarten in the United States and learned English very quickly and really just grew up knowing this country as my home country, although we traveled back and forth to El Salvador quite a bit.
Well, that's great. And so Alejandro, how about you?
Well, thank you, George, for having us. It's really a great pleasure to be here. Tell you a little bit about myself. I am a certified financial planner and a wealth advisor in the Coral Gables, Florida area. I've been in the financial planning industry since 2014, became a part of Mariner family back in 2019, and I'm a big fan of music, movies, and sports. I'm a first-generation Cuban American, so I was born and raised in Cuba. My family immigrated to the United States back in 1998, and I was 14 years old at the time. After finishing high school, I studied business administration and graduated from Florida International University with a major in finance. While working my way through college, lots of times I found myself talking with my friends and coworkers about what I was learning in school and basically passing on a lot of that good advice and ideas that I was learning onto them. Fast forward a few years later, and I discovered the CFP profession and the type of work that it entails. So I just fell in love with the concept of you get to help people make some of the most important decisions in their lives when it comes to their finances. And I studied some more. I passed my exams, got some more experience, and that's here I am today.
That's great. And Valerie, you were a wealth advisor as well. And how long have you been a wealth advisor here with Mariner now?
Yeah, I'm also a certified financial planner. I started with Mariner. It's been about 8 years, but I've been in the industry for, just over a decade now.
Just over a decade. Okay. So you guys have a lot of experience bringing this into it. Now, as your families, came to the United States, and a little bit different, again, my grandparents came here in 1918, as I said before, a lot different than coming in the last 20 years. When they came, it was literally right at the middle of the Spanish flu. And, it was really interesting is despite what's going on right now, this topic never came up in my family. I never knew this until it never really dawned on me. But it was a lot different back then when families came to the United States. And I'm curious to understand when your families came and as you got here, you had to learn the language, you had to kind of bring your customs with you at the same time, but also had to kind of come into a different culture, kind of a different world, if you will. Help me understand a little bit about how the time period in which you came, how that impacted kind of your youth and as you grew up, as well as kind of that work ethic that you have and kind of in your family structure. How did all of those things kind of converge?
In the case of my family, the way we came to the United States was because my father, back in 1991, he had a brother who had immigrated before him. This was back in 1980. You might remember the Mariel boat lift. That was a big deal. I
Yes,
know
I
a
do
lot of
remember that.
our listeners might recognize it from the movie Scarface, the very popular Al Pacino movie. That was the beginning. Well, my family took the opportunity to come here. My father's brother, he was an engineer in Cuba, but basically he felt like the system that they were establishing, it wasn't going to work for his family. So he took the opportunity and just picked his whole family up and left. Fast forward a few years later, he was able to claim my dad to come to the United States, and because it's a family member status. And then my father, because of the laws at the time, was able to claim political asylum. The Cuban situation for many, many years, as our listeners might know. So after that, my father became a resident. He started working. He worked many different jobs, of course, trying to establish himself. And after he became a citizen 5 years later, he was able to claim the rest of us, my mom, my brother, and myself. And that's when we immigrated, all of us together after him.
So he was here for a number of years before you came here.
Correct. For about 7 years.
About 7 years. Okay. Yeah, I don't know if folks sometimes realize how long sometimes it takes for, one family will get here and then how long it takes for the rest of the family to come alongside. And Valerie, it sounds like you all came kind of at the same time, if I understood that correctly.
Yeah, it was in the early 80s, different conflict, but very similar situation.
Yeah.
We came, as I mentioned, it was refugee status because of that civil war. Basically, there were threats to our lives at that point. And so it was a very quick situation that we came. I don't think my parents ever planned on leaving El Salvador because they do. They love that country. They love, the pace of life there. And so when they came, I think it was just a shock to their system, especially for my mom. My dad was a little bit more familiar with the customs here, and he had a bit more grasp of the language. But she never was able to finish her education. And so it was this complete, shift for her. And I remember as a kid growing up and feeling that insecurity that she had to some extent, that she's trying to bridge this gap. And then also, you're trying to raise your kids and be a strong, good example for them. But at the same time, you're asking them to really conquer a world that you don't know anything about. You mentioned about that length of time that it takes. I mean, I have an uncle, my mom's brother, him and his family, they've been trying for, I think, about 20 years now to come to the United States. But because there isn't that, I guess, emergency status now, just going through the regular system, it's incredibly painstaking and it takes a long time. And so, in some ways, maybe we were lucky in that we were able to take advantage of that situation and we were able to move quickly.
Yeah, and I know what you mean. When my grandfather came to the United States in 1918, he actually came. It was essentially an invitation from Santa Fe Railroad. They were bringing a lot of Mexican immigrants up to Kansas City and to the Midwest at that time. I think it was Ancestry.com. We came across his border crossing documentation. It was really kind of interesting. From 1918, he was 18 years old, and it said he was a musician and he was a cobbler. And if you don't know what a cobbler is, that is somebody who fixes shoes. And so that was his daytime job, but he actually got a job at the railroad. It was, again, completely different time at that period. But one of the things that, is when my dad grew up in the United States, he was actually born here in 1928 and right before the Great Depression. But one of the things I remember, hearing stories about was, how their pathway drove kind of their work style, their views of the future, views of retirement. And the interactions and way they supported their families. How did that manifest in your families?
I think for my family, I think that they did shift that. Their parents never retired. I mean, my father's father, he was killed in an accident in his 60s, so it was much younger. It basically was sort of a custom that you don't retire. You just sort of keep working and then your children will take care of you. But I think as they started to get older, they realized, that this is different in the United States and how they've been planning. they're far behind the curve on that. And so their retirement planning is nowhere near as robust as they would have liked if they could have started much earlier. My dad actually retired and moved back to El Salvador because of the cost of living. Everything that he tried and did here, it didn't, amount to enough to support him here. And my mom's still working and, trying to make that come true. But I think she is depending on us to help. And that's always, sort of been our expectation, I guess, within the Hispanic Latino community, is that you help your family. And that's just a given that they're going to need our support.
Yeah. Alejandro, how about you?
By the way, that's absolutely true, what Valerie just pointed out. My family history is a little bit different. It all starts with my paternal grandparents. My grandmother, she was very entrepreneurial. So she had her own business. And I remember certain things from when I was little, growing up in the province that where we were all from. Even though we lived in Havana, we're from a province that is on the east of Cuba. And she used to have a printing press business that she had from home. I remember being in a big house, and she would make ribbons for funeral processions. She would make party signs. That was her business. And my granddad, he started at the bottom in the electrical company in that province, Manzanillo, Cuba. And he went from sweeping the floors all the way to president of the company. Mm-hmm. And this all changed, obviously, after 1959, the Cuban Revolution. They took over, and basically everybody, thank you for everything you've done. We'll take over from here. So basically, they just took over the company. And so that started to change my family's perspective. And obviously, as things progress, a lot of our listeners might know what ended up happening and everything that followed with after the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro and the economy, how it collapsed basically, and the USSR, that dichotomy that took over. Really, the work ethic that was established by my grandmother in us, that was one of the things that endured, meaning she always taught us the value of saving because she went through it and she grew up during the Great Depression as well. It affected Cuba tremendously back then too. So my brother and I, we grew up knowing that we would eventually one day come here. For a long time, like I said, 7 years after my father left, we knew that we were gonna come here. So in a lot of ways, we knew we weren't going to go into the labor force. But once we got here, we did carry over some of that work ethic that my grandmother instilled in us, just so that we could make a better life here. And unfortunately, she had to stay behind, but we're thankful that we took the step, obviously, and that we're happy to be here.
Yeah. And great, great stories of very similar to my family as well. My grandfather and my father, their work ethic, it's almost the original, I guess, origins of the portfolio careers, right? Because you just do what you have to do to feed the family and to go after your dreams.
Thanks again for downloading this episode of Your Life Simplified, which is produced by Mariner Wealth Advisors. And at Mariner Wealth Advisors, we're here to serve as your advocate. We help people chart a course to reach their personal and financial goals so that they can have greater peace of mind that may lead to a more fulfilling life. We do this by always putting our clients first. Because as fiduciaries, we're required to provide guidance that's in the best interest of clients, not in the best interest of a company or shareholders or anyone else. So as you listen to this podcast and have questions about maybe your own financial situation, or would simply like a second opinion, or even you have an idea for a future podcast, please go ahead and email us at podcast@marinerwealthadvisors.com. If you found the information on this podcast valuable, please go ahead and share it with a friend or family member that you think might benefit from this information. And please don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss an episode. Thanks for listening, and now back to the episode.
When it comes to money, when you think of kind of what we do every day, we help our clients manage their lives and we help them manage their finances. And so what are some important money lessons that you learned along the way that you feel like that this upbringing, this coming to the United States kind of gave to you that you're passing on to your clients? What are some key things that you're doing today? Alejandro, why don't we start with you?
Number one is, might sound like an old cliche because we hear it so much, but it's basically pay yourself first. That is the number one thing to do. Always, obviously, save your part of your earnings. We all have bills to pay. We all have different commitments, but basically, pay yourself first. Don't live beyond your means. Always live within your means, and make sure you save your funds for a rainy day, because you will thank yourself many years down the road if you do this. You'll always be in a great shape to make decisions. If you have to change careers, change jobs, things like that, you want to have that flexibility. Basically, you want to have that money in the bank, as they say.
Yeah. Do you find that being caste centric is a big part of that as well? You know, for your family, is it for what you kind of learn along the way is having cash in the bank is really, really important versus, you know, maybe taking the time to invest those dollars to have them grow for you rather than just being sitting there?
Right. I can tell you that, yes, initially, yes, that is the original idea, is basically save your money and just always have the money in the bank. I can tell you from personal experience in the Hispanic community, at least the people I normally deal with, that's not always the case. There is a lot of people who are doubtful of the stock market, for example.
Sure.
And they do not trust putting their money in the stock market because they think it might be something that is too risky. It might be more like gambling or a casino. They make that connection a lot of times. And so they prefer a lot of times also to invest in real estate, something tangible, either that or their own business, and they grow their business. We all know the success stories out there and people become very successful, but for the most part, they tend to stay away from the stock market in general.
Yeah, I understand. And Valerie, how about you?
Yeah, I would agree that the entrepreneurial sense is really strong. I mean, when you go back to El Salvador, every other person has a little, mercado in their garage that they sell whatever they're going to sell, and just, they really depend on their understanding their cash flows. Like, I get cash in, and this is how I use my cash to spend over here. And so maybe investing and really understanding, employee stock purchase plans, or all kinds of some of those complexities that they can evolve out of having a business and really figuring out how to stay for the long term. Those aren't quite as familiar. And I think also, going back to El Salvador and kind of evolving through that initial crisis mode where it's just, we got to get what we can, and then so we can eat, and then try again tomorrow to try and, get more money. Just evolving from that, you understand that you need to, save. And then also that, living within your means can mean so much, because your means, well, clearly we were able to do it with much less. And so now my income has grown so much more. Isn't it possible that I could still live that same lifestyle? And, oftentimes we see people struggle, that they're making tons and tons of money, and yet they still feel like they're living paycheck to paycheck. And so that's something that, that shift in your mindset about what living within your means what that really means, is something that I try to communicate. I think that's a difficult concept to really evolve and capture in your head, but maybe that's one of the advantages, is that, we've seen some of that style of life evolve firsthand. Yeah.
Sure. To add to what Valerie just said, it's also the fact that we live in a society that credit is so accessible. It also makes us deviate from that concept of living within your means. Because credit is so accessible, a lot of times we feel, hey, let's get that gratification now because we can put it on a credit card, instead of knowing how to use your credit, how to build your credit for the bigger things, home ownership, or sending your kids through college, things like that, or taking on debt that has more of a value other than just put things on a credit card and just live day to day. I agree with Valerie 100%.
Yeah. So Valerie, you just shared a little bit about, kind of your family and the importance of family. And so what else can you share about, what's a little bit different, the way that your family interacts with even family back home in El Salvador? Because, sometimes it takes a little bit longer for everyone to get here. What are the things that you're working with your families with on that?
Yeah, within the Hispanic culture, especially for immigrants, is that oftentimes we want to support our family that is back home. It's just sort of an expectation, and it's ingrained within us that that's just part of life. And so, sending money back home is a common part of the financial plan, and it's just part of what we're going to do. And then, of course, caring for our elders.
Sure.
A lot of times people, when we talked about retirement, how that's not really a part of what we do, it's coming to light that estate planning is in fact important. Previously, it just came that you could live with your kids, and then when someone would die, maybe you would fundraise among your neighbors that you could pay for funeral expenses. But now it's really becoming too burdensome to do things that way, and so looking at life insurance and making a plan for leaving some money behind to help pay for those expenses is much more vital than ever before. And even things that are important within the community, like maybe quinceañeras or weddings that are just, have hundreds and hundreds of people. All of those are expenses that really need to be planned for in advance. And, many of the clients need to incorporate that in their financial plan.
Yeah, it's a really great point. I don't know that people realize that quinceañeras, can be almost as expensive as the whole wedding, the whole bowl, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, really great point. And I love what you're doing there is helping them plan, because that's what we do in our wealth management kind of role, is to help our clients plan, not just for their wealth, but also things that are going on in their life. So Alejandro, you mentioned a little bit earlier about the importance of using, having the right kind of amount of money in cash, and paying yourself first. But can you dig just a little bit deeper and help us understand, where does investing come in? When does it come in, and why?
So obviously, as part of any comprehensive financial plan, you will always have investments as part of that plan, especially in the world we live in today, where a lot of our wealth is tied to the market one way or the other, especially with even for those working people who are just starting out. They are just becoming participants in their 401ks at work, or they have an IRA. They fund their own retirement that way. There is a lot of places that we can take the opportunity to invest. And what I've found is that a lot of the times, usually people just keep the money in cash, not really, having apprehensions about the market, but it's really the place to go when it comes to wealth creation. You can think back over many hundreds of years in the history of the United States and the world, really, and you can think about, the great oil companies, the railroad companies, airlines, the big engines that have created wealth for humankind. There's nothing that comes even close to the stock market. We're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars, especially now that everything is so connected worldwide. So what I would say to our audience is always think of not only your savings and have the savings there to support you in case you need it, emergencies, and whether you're in transition from one job to another, but really you want to think about growth. And when it comes to growth, nothing compares to the stock market. So it's really something that you should focus on, and obviously educate yourself as best you can, because there's a lot of places that you can invest within the world of stocks, or the world of bonds, for example. So it's really something that a financial advisor can help you with, because there's so many choices to choose from, so many avenues to go through.
Well, thank both of you very much. You really provided some empowering words and advice for our listeners. And I think most importantly, some of the things that I'm taking away are these, and that is, number one, it's, just go after your dreams, and, and have a strategy to go, and don't be afraid to ask for help. Have a strategy to go forward with that. Ask for help. It's trusting others, I think, is really important. Build those trusting relationships with others to learn. But you also mentioned things like, the importance of family and how that comes into play, the importance of paying yourself first, making sure that you're not living beyond your means, having the right kind of emergency reserves. But I think equally as important in all of that is having a plan. don't just haphazardly go about all of this. Have a plan to engage yourself and your family, and that all can kind of come into that. And you both are very good at bringing the family as well as their overall personal plan into play. So that's going to include things like your legacy planning, your estate planning that Valerie was talking about, your overall wealth planning. But in addition to that, your investment strategies. Alejandro, you were talking about the importance of investing, and the way in which you go about that has to be a sound approach. It can't just be throwing things out there, right? It has to be a sound approach, and taking a sound approach and how that helps out in the long run. So I really appreciate all the words of wisdom that you've shared with us today. Well, we could probably spend another couple hours talking about this topic, but I know we don't have a couple hours to go. So kind of as we kind of conclude our conversation today, I want to thank you for sharing some of these insights into your families, but I want to end on something else. So we talk about at the very end of our conversations on a podcast is, what's your biggest money lesson? And I think we've already talked about that, so I won't go back to that. So what I'd like to end on something a little bit different than what we typically do, and that is, I'd like to understand your favorite tradition growing up, as it relates to, the family, kind of a cultural tradition or food tradition that you have. So Valerie, why don't we start with you on that?
Yeah, I think maybe because I love food, that my traditions definitely are very food centric. Whenever we go back, my sisters and I mean, pupusas are obviously the national food of El Salvador. And that's kind of like I don't know, fat tortilla with like things inside. And you just get them on every street corner. They're super cheap and they're so good. I love atol de elote, which is like it's like a corn-based drink. It's a hot drink, and that sounds gross when I say that way, but it's so good. And I don't know, just like all the different foods that there are, and getting together and just sharing time together over foods is absolutely my favorite.
Okay, yeah.
And for me, my taste after becoming more and more American every day has changed. So I don't eat a lot of the same food that I used to eat, but there's one thing that has stayed with me that I do appreciate every single holiday season, usually towards the parties that usually the family has on the 31st of December, is the roasted pig. That is something that I always, it's just a taste with the mojo, that dressing that we put on it. It's just something that I always will love, I think, as long as I live, and I will never get tired of eating that.
Yeah. Well, and for me personally, the traditions that we have when I grew up, when my grandparents came to the country, there really weren't very many traditions that they brought with them other than two things, and that was faith and food. And so we spent, a lot of times, going to Spanish Mass. And I remember growing up as a child, and Navidad, we'd always have a big celebration around Christmas and tamales around Christmas. And so that was always a very special time. But I would say for food, there's two foods that really strike me. Whenever I go to a Mexican restaurant, this is what I always order. It's like, and see if they have it. It's my kind of my litmus test. Do you have fideo, which is kind of a vermicelli spaghetti kind of food? It's either in a soup format or kind of a spaghetti side dish format. And chile. And chile is it's basically braised pork in manteca, which is lard. By the way, everything is cooked in lard. and so you braise it in lard, and then you mix it with tomatoes, hot peppers, onions, garlic, and salt. And basically, and it just kind of simmers in this stew, and it's so good. It just tenderizes the meat so much. And then, of course, you always have to have tortillas with it. My family, we always had flour tortillas, which is corn is really common today. It was common back then, but my grandparents couldn't get corn, so they only had flour. That's what my grandmother used to tell me. Anyway, but these are great stories. I love sharing these kinds of stories with our listeners, and I look forward to sharing many more. So I want to thank you guys, Alejandro, Valerie, gracias por acompañarme. This has been really a lot of fun. And thank you all for listening today. We hope you found this episode enjoyable. And as always, we'd love to hear from you. So let us know by giving us some feedback. And if you have any ideas for future podcasts, let us know that too by emailing us at podcast@marinerwealthadvisors.com. And as always, we encourage you to share the podcast with family and friends. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss a future episode of Your Life Simplified. We look forward to being with you again soon.
Mariner Wealth Advisors Advisors, or MWA, is an SEC-registered investment advisor with its principal place of business in the state of Kansas. Registration of an investment advisor does not imply a certain level of skill or training. MWA is in compliance with the current notice filing requirements imposed upon registered investment advisors by those states in which MWA maintains clients. MWA may only transact business in those states in which it is notice filed or qualifies for an exemption or exclusion from notice filing requirements. Any subsequent direct communication by MWA with a prospective client shall be conducted by a representative that is either registered or qualifies for an exemption or exclusion from registration in the state where the prospective client resides. For additional information about MWA, including fees and services, please contact MWA or refer to the Investment Advisor Public Disclosure website at www.advisorinfo.sec.gov. Please read the disclosure statement carefully before you invest or send money.